Welcome back, class. It's Dr. Lindner. We are talking about endocrinology or the endocrine system. And I really like this picture because it's an overview of the main endocrine glands. So on the left, right over here, we could see we have the brain, right? There's the brain. And within the brain, it looks like there are some endocrine portions. We have the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary, and off to the right here, we have the pineal or the pineal gland. So in a previous video, in an introductory video, when we started talking about endocrine system, we said that in terms of function, it's very closely related to the neural system. And you can see in the brain, we have three endocrine organs. Two of them are very, not that, the pineal gland isn't important, they're all important, but we're going to focus a whole lot on the hypothalamus and pituitary because they make an axis where one sends a message to the other, and then that sends a message to something else. So we'll put like hypothalamus first, and then the pituitary we'll put second, and then why not? Let's put thyroid third, and then we can also put adrenal third. I'll explain this. So the hypothalamus can send a chemical message to the pituitary, and then the pituitary will send a chemical message to the thyroid, or it can send a message to the adrenals. That's why I put three next to both of them. All right. So one of them, we can call it the HPT axis, and the other we can call the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary thyroid or hypothalamus pituitary adrenal. And I do have another video. I won't be talking about it here, but I do have a video on my YouTube channel that's really interesting that talks about the HPT HPA axis, which generally speaking, the adrenal glands help us adapt to stress. When we're under lots of stress, the adrenals send this crosstalk message to the thyroid and inhibit its function. So I talk about how chronic stress can create hypoactive thyroids. Okay. All right, let's look at the hypothalamus up here. And the hypothalamus can send what's called regulatory hormones. They regulate regulatory hormones. Some are called stimulating hormones, or some are called releasing hormones, and some are called inhibiting hormones. So the hypothalamus can send a thyroid releasing hormone in this direction, or it can send a thyroid inhibitory hormone in this direction. That's what we mean by regulation. It's kind of like an on or off switch, releasing or inhibiting type of chemical messages. The hypothalamus also produces ADH and oxytocin. ADH and oxytocin. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone, and there is a slide coming up that talks about all the abbreviations and what they stand for, so you don't have to go crazy writing it down. And ADH, antidiuretic hormone, if you think of it, a diuretic or diuresis, a diuretic makes you urinate, it makes you pee, right? An antidiuretic is against that. It makes you hold on to the water so you don't pee. And oxytocin has some interesting function, which we'll get into shortly, but it does have an influence on the woman's uterus and the mammary glands as well. So the hypothalamus can send a signal, let's say we'll call it TRH, thyroid releasing hormone because it's one of the regulatory hormones, and it's going to send it to the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary, you'll notice, has two main parts to it. It has an anterior lobe and it has a posterior lobe. Another name for pituitary is called hypophysis. See if I could spell it down here at the bottom. Hypophysis. That's an H. Hypophysis. There's an anterior and a posterior. So the anterior one they call adenohypophysis, and the posterior one they call neurohypophysis. The anterior one is sometimes called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is referred to as the neurohypophysis. Of the two lobes, you'll see the anterior lobe has more hormones that it's responsible for releasing, whereas the posterior lobe only has two. And look which two the posterior lobe releases. The two that were made in the hypothalamus, ADH and oxytocin. So the posterior lobe, the hypothalamus makes antidiuretic hormone, it makes oxytocin, and it stores it in that posterior lobe of the pituitary, in the neurohypophysis. So the posterior lobe can release oxytocin or ADH when it feels the need to. But in this case, the hypothalamus, I said, released TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. So it's going to go to the anterior lobe and it's going to go, all right, of all of these that it can release, the only one that's related to it is TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. So now TRH hits this receptor on the anterior pituitary, and then anterior pituitary says, okay, let's release thyroid stimulating hormone. So see if I can write it here. TSH. So the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, is going to come down and it's going to hit a receptor on the thyroid gland. And by its name, thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to stimulate the thyroid to produce hormones. Primarily T4, which gets converted to T3 in the presence of this mineral selenium in the liver. So hypothalamus released thyroid releasing hormone. It hits the pituitary, the anterior pituitary. It released thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland, stimulated the thyroid gland to produce T4, which is called thyroxine, as you see here. And thyroxine gets converted to T3, which is triiodothyronine. That conversion requires this mineral selenium. That's why selenium is so important in our diet, and our soils from the farms tend to be depleted of selenium. And this conversion primarily takes place in the liver. Some of it takes place in the thyroid, but the majority takes place in the liver. All right. So this is just showing the HPT axis, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. I just wanted to show you, since most of us can relate to the term he or she may have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism or a hyperactive thyroid or a hypoactive thyroid, or, you know, she just looks at a brownie and gains weight, or she can eat all the brownies in the world and ice cream sundaes and never gains a pound, right? This refers to thyroid function. Okay. Look what else the pituitary makes. ACTH, which again, I'm just going to, I'll let you know what these stand for. And on another slide, you'll see what, you don't have to write it because you'll see the abbreviations here with the description on another slide. But it stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So when you look at the name, we can go, all right, what is it going to relate to? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, adreno for adrenal gland. Okay, so you'll hear this adrenocorticotropic hormone. It can send a message to the adrenal gland. Pretty neat. We already talked about thyroid stimulating hormone. GH is growth hormone. PRL is prolactin, sounds like prolactation, lactation, milk production. FSH and LH go together, they're linked. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We'll talk about these in a little bit. And melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, so that's the pituitary. We spoke about the thyroid. We talked about T4 and T3. These are related to metabolism. I'll talk about calcitonin on a separate slide. And the reason being is that the thyroid works in conjunction off to the right with the parathyroid. The thyroid and parathyroid can work together in regulating calcium. Calcium is a really important mineral, and we all should have a pretty tight window of it in our blood, ranging from 9 to 11. And that what controls that is the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland with calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Okay. The adrenals, one of my favorite glands, the adrenals, really important gland. We will talk about its anatomy and how it relates to stress. The adrenal gland has two main parts to it. It has an outer part called the adrenal cortex, and it has an inner part called the adrenal medulla. This term cortex, you're going to hear a lot in anatomy and physiology. You can hear it when we talk about the kidneys, when we talk about the adrenals, even when we talk about bone or we talk about the brain. Cortex means bark, not like a dog barking, but the bark of a tree, which is the outer layer. So whenever you hear cortex, you're going to say to yourself, well, it probably has to be the outer part of that gland or the outer part of that organ. Whereas the medulla or adrenal medulla is the inner portion. Same thing when we do the kidneys. There's a cortex of the kidney and there's a medulla of the kidney. The cortex is on the outside, medulla is on the inside. When we talk about the brain, the outer part of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. All right. So we'll talk about the adrenal medulla, the inner part that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Sometimes you've heard of this as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex releases cortisol, cortisone, and aldosterone, and even androgens like testosterone. The pancreas, the endocrine portion, releases insulin and glucagon. These are involved in regulating blood sugar. When I say blood sugar, we think of glucose. So it regulates glucose levels in the blood. One of them increases the level, one of them decreases the level. We'll get into it shortly. In the brain, we have the pineal gland, not to be confused with pituitary. A lot of students confuse the two. The pineal releases melatonin, and you see the word tone. So think of it like melatonin tones you down. Melatonin tones you down, especially at night. It helps you sleep. There's lots of research with melatonin in helping people with irritable bowel disease, and very, very helpful with COVID. Melatonin. Not to be confused with melanin, right? Don't confuse melatonin with melanin. Melanin is skin pigmentation, right? Okay, so those are the main endocrine glands. Let's look at some of these secondary endocrine glands, which have secretory cells. Most of us aren't thinking about the heart as having endocrine function. We think of it as part of the cardiovascular system, but it releases something called ANP, which is atrial natriuretic peptide. Now, atrium, from the atrium of the heart, the upper chambers, natriuretic. When we look at the first two letters of natriuretic, it's Na. And Na comes from natrium. When you see Na, like Na plus and Cl minus, that's sodium chloride, which is salt. So Na is sodium. And we know that if you have too much sodium in your diet, that it could increase your blood pressure. So ANP, atrial natriuretic, it sounds like a diuretic, is a way that the heart can say, hey, we got too much sodium, our blood pressure is too high, let's get rid of some of the sodium so we can lower blood pressure. So the heart can actually work on regulating its own blood pressure. Pretty neat. Now, the opposite of that is aldosterone. Aldosterone is a mineral corticoid. Mineral corticoid. What mineral is it going to work with? Sodium. What aldosterone does is it says, hey, we're going to hold on to sodium. And if we hold on to sodium, we're going to attract water. And if you think of having like salty pretzels and salty potato chips, anything salty, innately after you eat it, you become thirsty. And that can increase blood pressure. So if you hold on to sodium, you hold on to water. Water and minerals go together. That's why it's called mineral water, right? So if you lose minerals, water is going to follow the minerals. So if you're losing sodium and magnesium and potassium in your urine, you're going to follow, water will follow it. Wherever you have minerals, water follows. So aldosterone is a way of helping the body hold on to sodium. And if you hold on to sodium, you hold on to water, and that will eventually increase blood pressure. But ANP is saying, hey, let's decrease the amount of sodium, which decreases the water, and your blood pressure goes down. So they're antagonistic to one another. Okay, thymus, which is not the thyroid. Don't confuse thyroid. Up here, this is your thyroid, but here is your thymus. And that's involved with your immune system. When you're little, up until about the age of 7, the thymus gland increases in size. And after that, throughout adulthood, it starts to atrophy or shrink a little bit. But in the first 7, 8 years or so of life, think of it, a kid is crawling, he's like a human vacuum, putting everything in his mouth. The immune system has to respond to it, and the thymus is responsible for making T cells. It secretes thymosins, which help produce T cells. Okay. Adipose tissue. We spoke about fat cells. They secrete cytokines. They secrete cytokines and also leptin. If you eat food that has fat in it, your body releases leptin, and it's supposed to make you feel full. Your satiety center is hit. All right, so you stop eating. That's what leptin does. Your digestive tract, we have in the stomach, if there's fat that's in your stomach, that fat, let's say the food that you eat that has fat, goes into the duodenum right over here. It goes into the duodenum. And your duodenum or your duodenum releases something called CCK, cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin. And cholecystokinin is going to go to your gallbladder. Now, if I were to draw that here for you, let's just see. We'll make it, we'll make I'll put in a liver here. So let's say the liver is over here, and then I'll put the gallbladder, which is green. We'll put the gallbladder, let's say here, right? So liver and gallbladder are right next to each other. So the liver makes something called bile. It makes bile, but it stores it in the gallbladder. So the gallbladder stores the bile that the liver made. So when you have fat from the stomach that enters the duodenum sends this chemical messenger called CCK to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder pushes out bile. And the bile goes right into the duodenum and it breaks down the fat. It's a fat emulsifier. Okay. And I know many of you may have questions. Well, what happens if you have gallstones? So I do have other videos on my YouTube channel that goes into a little bit more detail on the liver gallbladder connection. And I have in my video, I actually show the ductwork and I show gallstones and what they look like. And so please make some time to just review those under the digestive system. Okay. Okay. The kidneys. The kidneys secrete EPO, which is erythropoietin. When you look at the word erythropoietin, erythro means red. It's like erythrocyte. An erythrocyte is a red blood cell. So erythropoietin, the word poietin means to produce. So erythropoietin is a hormone that helps us produce red blood cells. It increases the number of red blood cells. So all the blood goes to the kidneys. The kidneys are filtering out the blood, and the kidneys make the perfect organ to assess what your oxygen levels are in your body, because we know that red blood cells carry oxygen. If oxygen levels dip, then your kidneys go, hey, we're going to release some erythropoietin, and we're going to go to the bone or the bone marrow, and the bone marrow is going to push out more red blood cells, because the more red blood cells you have, the more potential you have to bind to oxygen, because in red blood cells we have iron. And we know that oxygen binds to the iron, which is in the hemoglobin of a red blood cell. Calcitriol, well, calcitriol is our vitamin D. So the kidneys are responsible for making vitamin D. Then we have the gonads, the testes. They can produce testosterone, and the ovaries can make estrogen and progesterone. Okay. Okay. When I come back, I'll go over those again. We'll go over the names. We'll go over some of their primary functions. So let's take a next break.